The morning light crept through the blinds of my suburban Waco home, touching the scattered papers on the kitchen counter. I sat at the table, staring at the figures in front of me, fingers drumming lightly as I tried to convince myself this was just another contribution, another moment of helping my family without recognition. $22,000. A sum that could have padded my savings for months, maybe even allowed me a small getaway I'd been dreaming about. Instead, it was earmarked for my sister's wedding, a celebration she would remember while I quietly shouldered the weight. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the house still quiet except for the occasional creak from the floors above. Mom, Velma, was hovering in the doorway, her presence subtle yet unrelenting. She didn't need to say much, her glance carried the weight of expectation. "It's family, Deverly. We do things together," she said, her tone calm but firm, the kind that left no room for debate. I nodded, smiling politely, though inside I wrestled with the familiar mix of duty and quiet resentment. Helping felt right, but recognition? Rarely, if ever, came my way. I knew the drill by now. The thought of contributing such a large amount gnawed at me. I wanted to help, of course, but my mind ran over the silent calculations, bills, upcoming projects, the freelance work that didn't always pay on time. Was I being manipulated? I shook off the thought, telling myself family comes first, yet the ache of invisibility clung stubbornly. I had learned early that voicing dissent rarely changed anything, my observations and quiet intelligence were my arsenal. I was cautious, strategic, keeping my emotions guarded. Then came the conversation that always stung. Velma and Savannah Ray, my sister, sitting across the table with a mix of earnestness and unspoken pressure. "We really need your help with the wedding," Savannah said, her eyes wide, but her smile tight, rehearsed. Velma leaned in, voice gentle but insistent. "Deverly, you're the one who can make this happen. It's your responsibility too." I sighed, feeling the familiar tug of guilt and obligation. Family doesn't come cheap, apparently. My inner monologue wrestled with ethics and limits. How much of my own life was I meant to sacrifice for appearances? Days later, I discovered I had been omitted from the earliest planning discussions. Emails and text chains outlined venues, seating arrangements, even floral choices, yet my name never appeared. Invitations to preliminary gatherings arrived late or not at all, casual phrasing like, "We'll let you know if we need anything," stinging sharper than outright rejection. I noticed subtle shifts in body language, avoided glances, tight smiles, small gestures that underscored my exclusion. Frustration churned within me, but alongside it grew determination. I would observe, learn, and decide my course. The quiet intelligence I prided myself on demanded patience, even as my heart simmered with a mix of hurt and resolve. Watching my mother and sister interact reinforced old hierarchies I had long accepted but never embraced. Velma's authority was unspoken yet unmistakable. Cultural norms, middle-class expectations, and generational assumptions shaped the household dynamic. I took note of the little slights, a seat farther from the center, conversations where my input was ignored, jokes that skirted my presence entirely. These small details were windows into the larger pattern of undervaluation, each observation sharpening my awareness and quiet resilience. You can't control the family, only your reaction, I reminded myself, repeating the proverb like a mantra, letting it anchor me. Reflecting on past occasions when I had been overlooked, I found the familiar pang of disappointment mingled with something else, resolve. A small heirloom, a delicate silver brooch my mother had once handed me, lay on the counter. It was an inconspicuous object, yet it carried memories of appreciation rarely expressed, a subtle reminder of my worth despite repeated oversight. That brooch became my silent witness, an anchor for emotions I wasn't allowed to voice openly. The knowledge of past sacrifices, combined with this quiet symbol, strengthened my resolve to navigate what was coming with clarity and strategy. The day of the partial wedding setup arrived, sunlight gleaming off the polished floors and decorated tables, yet the pang of invisibility struck hard. I parked outside the church, staring at the guests mingling. How had I ended up invisible again? The realization hit me with a mix of shock and disbelief, a bitter taste that lingered as I remained in the car for a long moment. Even my careful planning, my willingness to contribute, seemed to have no effect. I gritted my teeth, inhaled slowly, and reminded myself that observation was as much a weapon as confrontation. I wouldn't react impulsively, but neither would I remain powerless. There was a reckoning to be planned, patience to be exercised, and a quiet intelligence to be leveraged. I parked my car along the quiet street beside the church, the early afternoon sun bouncing off the stained glass windows. In my hands, I clutched the folder containing the receipts, notes, and confirmation of my $22,000 contribution, a tangible proof of my investment in this day that, somehow, had already begun to sideline me. As I stepped onto the paved walkway, the faint scent of fresh flowers mixed with the aroma of polished wood and faint candle wax from inside the church. Guests were milling about, laughter and clinking glasses blending with soft music. But I felt the chill of invisibility before I even walked through the doors. Inside, the seating chart caught my eye immediately. My name wasn't listed. Not on the primary table, not anywhere in sight. The air, filled with the hum of polite conversation, seemed to close in slightly. I paused, surveying the room, taking in who had arrived, who laughed together, who whispered with small nods and sidelong glances. My pulse quickened, not with anger, but with that prickling sense of being overlooked. After everything I've done, this is how I'm treated? I reminded myself to breathe, to note, to observe. There was no need to react yet. Walking toward the small reception area, I noticed the wedding planner, a professional woman in crisp attire, glancing at me as she arranged name cards. She nodded politely, but her attention remained fixed on Savannah, discussing arrangements as if I weren't there. I caught fragments of dialogue, the casual prioritization of my sister's wishes. We'll adjust the seating if needed, but Savannah prefers my stomach twisted with a mixture of hurt and strategic calculation. Sometimes the loudest voice is the one they hear first, even if it's not the most important. I filed the thought away, silently evaluating how to navigate the unfolding scene without creating an early confrontation. When I found my seat, near the restroom and a few feet from the main family table, it became painfully clear how the hierarchy was structured. Guests passed by, exchanging smiles and small talk, avoiding eye contact with me. Even minor glances carried subtle emphasis, a silent message of the social order I had been placed into. I sat with my back straight, absorbing every interaction, cataloging every whispered comment and sidelong glance. I reminded myself that patience and awareness were as potent as any spoken words. As the ceremony preparation continued, I observed Savannah flitting between her friends and family, orchestrating conversations, coordinating with our mother. Velma's quiet nods reinforced the unspoken chain of command, the generational patterns of control and expectation were laid bare. I made mental notes: who holds influence, who quietly bends, who laughs to maintain appearances. I had learned that knowledge is power, even if no one sees it. That knowledge now fueled my calm resolve. The heirloom from my mother, a delicate silver brooch I carried in my clutch, felt heavier in my pocket. Its presence reminded me of past instances where my efforts were overlooked, where small gestures had gone unrecognized. Here it was again, a symbol connecting the present slight to a continuum of undervalued contributions. I allowed a quiet smile, a subtle acknowledgement of my own strength. Composure would serve me better than outburst, observation would be my silent ally. I watched as Savannah laughed with a circle of guests, her attention radiant and unshared, fully aware that my presence, and my contribution, remained invisible. Frustration and disappointment bubbled beneath the surface, tempered by a controlled patience. The sense of being unseen did not diminish my awareness; if anything, it sharpened it. Every interaction, every deliberate omission, became part of the larger picture I was piecing together, a mental map of alliances, oversights, and leverage. As the afternoon waned, I felt the familiar knot of quiet indignation and strategic anticipation coiling tighter. This wasn't the end of the story. I adjusted the strap of my purse, straightened my shoulders, and let my eyes scan the room one more time. Every slight, every overlooked gesture, every deliberate exclusion was catalogued for future reckoning. I would wait, observe, and then decide my course with the precision that years of silent endurance had honed. I moved through the reception hall quietly, letting the buzz of conversation wash over me without pulling me in. Savannah floated from group to group, her laughter bright, her hand gestures precise, drawing attention effortlessly. I noted how she dominated every discussion, how even subtle comments she made seemed to steer everyone's perception, bending the flow of attention toward her. I kept my distance, clutching my purse and the folder of contributions, letting my eyes capture each interaction with quiet scrutiny. The clinking of glasses, the floral arrangements carefully positioned on tables, the soft background music, all of it felt like a performance staged without my presence. I thought back to the months leading up to this day, all the planning and money I had contributed, the silent sacrifices, and a quiet frustration settled in my chest. It's strange, I mused, how you can give everything and still be overlooked. Knowledge of these dynamics made me patient but no less attentive. I catalogued every glance, every whispered word, every polite but dismissive nod, aware that patience was now my greatest ally. As the evening unfolded, subtle humiliations began to stack. My drink arrived late, servers assuming I was a guest rather than someone who had helped orchestrate much of the day. A cousin passed by, barely acknowledging my presence while congratulating Savannah for coordinating every detail flawlessly. It's like being invisible with a checkbook in your hand, I thought bitterly, a wry smile tugging at my lips. Part of me wanted to speak up, to demand recognition, but I weighed the timing carefully. Confrontation now would look petty, strategic observation could yield more influence later. I watched, silently cataloging each slight, each missed acknowledgement, letting my irritation fuel a growing sense of quiet resolve. The injustices stacked like blocks in my mind, forming a structure I intended to use in the future. From my vantage point, I could see the subtle alliances forming and solidifying. Velma moved with deliberate poise, coordinating with Savannah as though conducting a silent orchestra, signaling who should speak, who should laugh, who should appear to matter. Whispers skimmed across the tables, fleeting glances reinforcing my peripheral status. My mind parsed each exchange, noting which relatives were aligned with Savannah, which ones were cautious, and which simply followed along. Appearances here dictated influence, and I understood the game at play. The hierarchy was subtle but undeniable. I took notes in my head, preparing for when the time came to shift the balance. Knowledge, I reminded myself, could be far more potent than any emotional outburst. I retreated to a small corner table, away from the limelight, using the moment to reflect on what had transpired. Each slight reinforced my self-awareness, each whispered judgment heightened my determination. The heirloom brooch from my mother rested lightly in my purse, a tangible echo of past experiences where my efforts had been dismissed. It reminded me that composure and strategy mattered more than immediate recognition. I catalogued every minor injustice, every overlooked effort, every subtle slight, knowing that this information would become leverage when the right moment arrived. Resentment mixed with calm intelligence, forming a potent combination of observation and planning. A particularly jarring moment arrived when Savannah publicly thanked contributors, highlighting gifts and efforts of others while skimming over my own. A few guests noticed the omission, their expressions shifting subtly, but no one called it out. My chest tightened, a mixture of tension and disappointment brewing inside me. I kept my composure, letting the recognition, or lack thereof, settle into my mental ledger. I wasn't invisible in terms of awareness, and I would not remain invisible in terms of influence. Each passing minute strengthened my resolve to turn these oversights into actionable insight. Timing, I knew, would determine the outcome. As the reception continued, I jotted subtle notes in my journal, mental reminders of observations and vulnerabilities. I noticed a minor slip from Savannah, a laugh too loud, a gesture slightly misaligned that others didn't catch. I marked it mentally, a small seed for a future shift in balance. Though outwardly composed, a quiet anticipation had taken root. Each overlooked contribution, each deliberate exclusion, was shaping the strategy one would deploy later. I would wait, assess, and act with precision, turning these hidden grievances into silent leverage. The evening stretched onward, filled with chatter and laughter, yet I felt the pulse of control steadily in my hands, unseen but meticulously mapped. By the time the evening settled in, the reception hall had a warm glow from chandeliers reflecting off polished wood floors, yet an invisible tension hummed beneath the surface. I moved among the clusters of guests, observing, noting every interaction, every subtle gesture that spoke volumes. Savannah's presence was magnetic. She floated through the room, directing attention with ease, acknowledging others' contributions with an air of generosity, while mine seemed to vanish into the background. I held my composure, recognizing which moments were worth challenging and which were better recorded for later. The faint scent of roses mingled with the soft laughter, and the tinkle of glasses punctuated conversations that didn't include me. I knew the hall's orchestration, the careful positioning of tables, the deliberate flow of movement, it all seemed designed to highlight her influence and obscure mine. Yet, in quiet observation, I felt a cautious clarity, realizing that understanding these dynamics granted me a subtle power I intended to use. The first subtle affront came as Savannah publicly thanked several family members and friends for their efforts, carefully skipping over my name. A whisper of awareness rippled through some guests, but they didn't speak aloud, their hesitations noticeable only to me. I felt a pang of embarrassment and a surge of anger, yet I maintained outward calm. Being unseen didn't mean I hadn't shown up, and I made a mental note to carry this into my strategy. I smiled politely, nodding at compliments directed toward others, cataloging the moment in my mind. Each slight, each omission, became data for a larger plan. I had learned that restraint and timing were essential. Reacting impulsively could erode the credibility and patience I had been cultivating for years. Quietly, I began to assert my presence without making a scene, seeking opportunities to influence without confrontation. Carefully, I positioned myself to offer assistance with a minor task, making my contributions visible without demanding recognition. Observing the reactions of Velma, Savannah, and the wedding planner, I noticed subtle surprise on some faces, slight dismissal on others. It was a delicate balance, showing capability and involvement while keeping composure. I reflected on past experiences, remembering how I had learned to navigate family manipulation with restraint and intelligence. Each minor action was a step toward influence, each glance and gesture carefully measured. I knew that influence need not be loud to be effective, and I quietly relished the awareness that my presence, though understated, had not gone unnoticed by those paying closer attention. As the evening progressed, I analyzed the social dynamics further, considering each slight, each interaction, and the ripple effect they created. I thought about the symbolic heirloom I had carried from past gatherings, its presence now anchoring my reflection, a reminder of my perseverance and personal strength. Every oversight, every small exclusion, only sharpened my focus. I cataloged alliances, potential allies, and weak points in the family hierarchy. My mind worked methodically, planning the timing and approach for a more significant strategic move while maintaining social grace. The observation was painstaking but necessary, each note stored in memory for moments that demanded action. In quiet corners, I continued to watch the micro-behaviors of Savannah and Velma, noting their subtle coordination and the ways they subtly manipulated perceptions among the guests. Some attendees, perhaps intuitively, began to acknowledge my contributions with small nods or whispered comments, though the recognition remained muted. I used this awareness to reinforce my mental ledger of influence, understanding who might support me later and who would need careful handling. My patience was growing, and so was my resolve, knowing that the right move could shift the entire dynamic in my favor. By the end of the evening, a small but telling mistake by Savannah caught my attention, an overreach, a moment of overconfidence unnoticed by the rest. I made a silent note in my journal, a mental bookmark of the opportunity it presented. The room buzzed with celebration around me, yet I sat poised, calm, and observant. In that quiet collection of details, I found empowerment. Each omission, each oversight, and each misstep had purpose now, forming a roadmap for the next steps I would take. Patience and strategy had become my allies, and I understood that the real confrontation, quiet yet decisive, was just beginning. As the early evening deepened, I lingered near the periphery of the reception hall, taking a quiet breath and reviewing the mental notes I'd accumulated. Every slight, every omission, every unacknowledged contribution had been carefully catalogued. I reminded myself that subtlety, timing, and composure were my greatest allies. The music shifted to softer notes, the murmurs of guests blending with the clink of glasses and the occasional laughter spilling from clusters of friends. I scanned the room, noting which guests seemed receptive, which might serve as allies, and where Savannah's attention was focused. I understood the social currents at play and felt a growing determination. This was not a moment for confrontation but for assertion, strategic, deliberate, visible without appearing combative. I straightened my posture, adjusted a small decorative element on a table, and felt the satisfaction of quietly taking my place in the room without fanfare. For once, my presence would be seen, even if subtly, and I could measure the impact without risking overt escalation. I moved closer to a group of servers, offering to help with a minor task, ensuring that my actions were noticed by guests circulating nearby. Some glanced in my direction, eyebrows lifting slightly in recognition of my initiative, while others gave a polite nod. I knew these gestures were small but cumulatively meaningful. It was a quiet assertion of capability, my contributions mattered, even if unacknowledged verbally. I caught snippets of conversation, whispers among minor guests noticing the discrepancy between effort and recognition. A sense of satisfaction mingled with resolve as I realized that influence could be exerted without needing to confront Savannah directly. My mind replayed prior interactions, confirming that restraint and strategic timing were far more powerful than immediate rebuttal. Savannah, perhaps sensing a shift, made a passing remark toward me, laced with mild dismissal, a subtle attempt at undermining. I paused briefly, a flicker of irritation passing through me, then responded with a calm, precise comment, quiet enough to maintain composure but sharp enough to leave a subtle impression. The room held a fraction of tension in that moment, perceptible only to those paying attention. I observed her reaction carefully, slight surprise, a flicker of reconsideration, and filed it away as data for later use. It was a demonstration of measured assertiveness, an acknowledgement that I would no longer fade into invisibility, yet without sparking unnecessary conflict. Every word, every gesture, had to be purposeful, a quiet demonstration of intelligence and emotional control. Continuing my careful observations, I noticed minor oversights by Savannah and Velma, trivial yet revealing in the broader context. A misplaced flower arrangement, a mismanaged timing cue with a minor guest, all recorded in my mind as leverage points for moments that might demand attention. I also noted subtle acknowledgments from other attendees, small nods or polite smiles that suggested they recognized my contributions even if unspoken. These quiet affirmations strengthened my sense of empowerment and underscored the importance of patience. My presence was becoming undeniable, not by proclamation, but through consistent, strategic action. Each interaction was a building block toward a more visible role, each careful move calculated for maximum effect when the right moment came. By the time I caught sight of a small, yet telling, mistake in the event setup, a chair slightly out of alignment with the main table, it felt like a sign. The opportunity to assert influence was approaching, subtle yet tangible. I allowed a small, inward smile, feeling the quiet thrill of anticipation. I understood the value of this moment. It was the perfect opening to demonstrate capability and reclaim acknowledgement without needing to raise my voice or challenge Savannah publicly. The evening continued around me, guests engaging and unaware, yet I felt a quiet satisfaction. My strategy was taking shape, my presence asserting itself in ways that could not be ignored. Patience and subtlety had become my allies, and I knew that my next move would carry the weight of careful observation and deliberate action. The reception hall had settled into a quieter rhythm as evening deepened, the dim lights casting soft shadows across the tables and floral arrangements. I leaned against a pillar, scanning the room with calm focus, noting the movements of guests, the subtle gestures of family members, and the patterns that had quietly emerged over the course of the day. Every slight, every ignored effort, every whispered acknowledgement, or lack thereof, was catalogued in my mind. This wasn't the moment for rash action, it was the moment to calculate, to observe, to prepare my first visible but controlled move. The ambient music wove around the low murmur of conversation, punctuated by clinking glasses and the occasional laugh. I took a slow breath, reminding myself that restraint could be just as powerful as confrontation, and that influence could be exerted without raising my voice or creating a scene. A small disruption caught my attention. A centerpiece had been slightly misaligned, and a server seemed uncertain how to adjust it without drawing attention. I stepped forward, offering to reposition the arrangement and guide the server. My actions were subtle, deliberate, executed with care, yet visible enough for nearby guests to notice. A few exchanged glances, recognizing the quiet competence behind the gesture. Savannah's expression flickered, just a hint of discomfort, a minor acknowledgement that she had been observed, her control subtly challenged. Internally, I felt a flicker of satisfaction, the sort that comes from exerting influence while remaining calm, measured, and in control. I noted each micro-reaction, each slight tilt of a head, each lingering glance. This was my first countermove, small in scale but meaningful in its execution. Savannah, seemingly sensing a shift in the room, directed a dismissive remark toward me, lightly veiled in polite sarcasm. I felt the familiar sting of being underestimated but held my composure. My response was deliberate, a measured and clever retort that asserted my presence without escalating tension. The words landed with just enough subtlety to make the room pause for a split second, a momentary recalibration that did not overtly challenge the festivities but hinted that I was no longer invisible. Guests nearby noted the exchange, the faint shift in social dynamics, while I silently logged Savannah's reactions, subtle surprises, micro-expressions, and shifts in posture that would all become important leverage in the chapters ahead. This was not triumphal, it was precise, calculated empowerment. I stepped back slightly, observing how the ripple of my interventions affected others. Minor guests seemed to take note of my competence, exchanging glances that suggested recognition. I catalogued potential allies and neutral parties, noting which interactions could be amplified in future maneuvers and which required patience. Velma's subtle cues, the brief tightening of her lips, the half-smile that didn't reach her eyes, spoke volumes about the underlying family hierarchy and the small cracks forming in Savannah's control. Each observation fed into a growing internal map, a strategy for how I would navigate forthcoming challenges while maintaining composure and respectability. A quiet sense of vindication settled in me as I reflected on my actions. There was no exhilaration in the dramatic sense, no need for applause or immediate acknowledgement. Instead, there was a steady, resolute awareness that measured patience and thoughtful execution carried their own power. I had proven, quietly but unmistakably, that my presence mattered. Every slight I had endured, every overlooked effort, had prepared me to act with precision and to leverage subtle opportunities as they arose. The room continued around me, guests engrossed in conversation, unaware of the small shift in authority that had occurred, yet feeling it in the nuances of interaction and response. Then I noticed it, a subtle error by Savannah in front of the guests, small yet revealing, a misaligned table setting, a slight hesitance in her instruction to a server. My eyes narrowed with anticipation. This was the opening I had been waiting for, the chance to escalate my influence with minimal exposure. I allowed myself a quiet, inward smile, feeling the thrill of strategy and preparation converging. I understood that the next moves would carry greater impact, that my subtle countermove had set the stage for a more visible demonstration of control and recognition. Every prior observation, every restrained action, every moment of composure had led to this opportunity. The evening was far from over, and I was ready. The room seemed to pulse with quiet energy as the evening wore on, the soft amber glow from overhead fixtures casting long shadows across the tables and highlighting the careful arrangements of flowers and linens. I moved through the reception hall with an almost surgical precision, noting every glance, every whispered exchange, every subtle shift in posture. Savannah's overconfidence, so pronounced just an hour ago, now revealed cracks, a flustered smile here, a misdirected instruction there, a slight hesitation in coordinating the servers. My mind catalogued each detail, measuring, weighing, and assessing the opportunities these moments presented. I reflected on the small victories I had carved out during the earlier phases of the evening, the repositioned centerpiece, the measured retort to her thinly veiled comment, and felt a surge of anticipation. Every subtle acknowledgement I had earned now laid the foundation for more visible, high-stakes interventions. I adjusted the strap of my purse and walked along the edge of the hall, calculating the precise timing to exert influence without overt confrontation, relying on the echo-emotional anchor to guide my actions and sustain my composure. I spotted my first leverage point when Savannah struggled to manage the flow of guests between tables and the dance floor. A server hesitated, unsure of where to place an additional set of linens, and Savannah's quick, anxious glance betrayed her uncertainty. I stepped in with quiet confidence, offering direction and subtly realigning a misplaced table setting. The gesture was small but unmistakable, executed with calm authority. Guests nearby noticed, exchanging glances that acknowledged my competence. Savannah's face tightened for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to recognize the slight, controlled irritation, and I silently catalogued the moment as the first tangible shift in influence. Each action, each measured correction, was a chess move, placing me closer to the subtle mastery I sought, establishing credibility without overtly challenging the social order. The next challenge came swiftly. Savannah, perhaps sensing a shift in the room, threw out a thinly veiled comment, meant to undermine or diminish my contribution, but I had anticipated the maneuver. I responded with a poised, slightly witty remark that asserted my presence without raising tension. The room quieted for a heartbeat, the subtle power dynamic tilting imperceptibly but decisively. I noticed the reactions, minor guests offering fleeting smiles of acknowledgement, Velma's lips pressing into a tight line, Savannah's eyes flickering with frustration. Every micro-expression was data, every pause in conversation an opportunity to consolidate my position. I realized that influence wasn't about dominance in volume or visibility, it was about strategic, controlled assertion, calculated timing, and observing the psychological effects of each interaction. I moved along the perimeter, watching, listening, processing. Guests began subtly aligning with my gestures, appreciating the attention to detail, the calm authority I exhibited. I catalogued potential allies, noting who was receptive to influence and who remained neutral, storing each observation for future application. Savannah's minor errors accumulated, a misaligned escort card here, a hesitant correction there, and I silently mapped out how each misstep could serve as leverage. The thrill was not in confrontation but in mastery, in directing outcomes without overt aggression, in bending social dynamics subtly yet effectively in my favor. A deep, steady focus anchored me as I reflected internally. The emotions of earlier slights, the hurt, the indignation, the quiet frustrations, were present but controlled, channeled into strategic planning rather than impulsive reaction. I felt a growing sense of empowerment, a clarity of purpose. Each subtle intervention had begun to shift perceptions, and with careful observation, I could predict responses before they occurred. The mastery I sought was not immediate gratification but measured, deliberate, undeniable influence. The room's energy, the minor yet telling acknowledgments from guests, and the subtle cracks in Savannah's control all pointed to a turning point. I could sense the strategic advantage coalescing, the moment to act with more pronounced impact approaching. Then it arrived, a small, unmistakable misstep from Savannah, a hesitation as she instructed the catering staff, a visible ripple of disorganization. I recognized the opening instantly, the culmination of careful observation, quiet intervention, and psychological patience. I allowed myself a controlled smile, fully aware that this was the opportunity to convert accumulated strategic patience into decisive action. The audience in the room, both minor guests and family members, would perceive competence, calm authority, and intelligence in my handling of the situation. The chessboard was set, the pieces aligned, and the next move would shift the dynamics irrevocably. Timing was everything, and I was prepared. The room felt charged, a low hum of murmurs and clinking glasses under the soft glow of overhead lights. I paused at the edge of the main reception hall, surveying the gathered faces, noting who had quietly aligned with me over the course of the evening. The air was thick with anticipation, each subtle shift, each nervous glance from Savannah told me the moment of exposure was imminent. I recalled every carefully orchestrated intervention from the previous hours, the repositioned centerpiece, the discreet corrections, the witty but controlled remarks, and felt a sense of readiness. My hand brushed against the small heirloom I'd carried since the morning, a quiet anchor for both memory and intention. Tonight, the culmination of patience and observation would unfold, and timing, as always, was everything. I seized the first opening when Savannah attempted to coordinate the final toast, misplacing the order of acknowledgments and causing a minor ripple of confusion among the guests. Calmly, I interjected, suggesting the correct sequence with measured clarity. The room's energy shifted almost imperceptibly. Eyes lingered on me, acknowledging the competence I displayed. Savannah's jaw tightened, a flash of irritation crossing her features, and I could see the slight stutter in her attempts to maintain composure. Every gesture, every precise word was deliberate, calculated to expose her oversight without creating chaos, to showcase control without overt confrontation. Guests exchanged subtle nods, recognizing the intelligence behind my actions, and the balance of influence began tipping unmistakably in my favor. Noticing her faltering, Savannah tried to regain dominance. She leaned into the nearest guests, raising her voice slightly to question my suggestions and, by implication, my credibility. I had anticipated this, having mentally prepared proof and context to neutralize her challenge. With calm authority, I presented the facts of her earlier errors, minor mismanagement in seating, forgotten acknowledgments, subtle omissions that went unnoticed until now. The effect was immediate. Guests shifted, whispering, glancing back and forth between us, sensing the injustice she had attempted to mask. Savannah's composure wavered, her defensive stance betrayed frustration, and I maintained mine, steady, unwavering, letting the evidence speak louder than any raised voice could. Finally, I executed the decisive maneuver. A small, deliberate exposition of the accumulated mismanagement, timed to coincide with her attempt to redirect attention, unraveled her carefully maintained facade. Gestures, words, and visible documents combined to illustrate the truth clearly, irrefutably. The room quieted, all eyes on Savannah, who now seemed visibly shaken. Guests reacted with subtle, approving glances toward me, acknowledgement without fanfare but undeniably present. The emotional payoff was satisfying, the previously invisible contribution, the careful patience, and strategic interventions now earned visible recognition. I felt the weight of years of restraint, frustration, and observation crystallize into authority and presence. The shift was complete, the moral high ground firmly held. In the aftermath, I surveyed the room again, noting subtle changes in social alignment. Velma's posture softened, minor guests exchanged looks that spoke volumes about newfound respect. Internally, I reflected on the journey, the quiet indignities, the careful observations, the deliberate assertions, all culminating in this moment of measured vindication. The heirloom in my hand seemed to glow in significance, echoing the symbolic anchor of patience, resilience, and intelligence. The story was nearly concluded, yet the tension lingered, the family's dynamics had shifted, but the underlying currents promised that one final reckoning remained. Even after the truth came out, the story wasn't completely over, there was still one last reckoning. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a gentle warmth over the garden where I now sat, sipping tea and letting the events of the previous night settle into memory. The confrontation, once looming so large, had shifted the currents of our family dynamic. Faces that had once ignored me now offered subtle acknowledgments, nods of recognition, or a quiet smile that conveyed understanding without words. I breathed in the calm, the aroma of blooming jasmine mingling with the fresh scent of cut grass, grounding me in the present while the echoes of prior tension slowly faded. The household felt lighter, even in the silence between conversations, and I reflected on the strategy, patience, and quiet intelligence that had brought me here. For the first time in years, the weight of invisible effort felt recognized, if not celebrated, and that alone carried its own satisfaction. I moved indoors, finding Velma tending to the kitchen with her usual diligence but with a softness I hadn't noticed before. I joined her, not with confrontation but with calm conversation, acknowledging past missteps while emphasizing understanding over recrimination. We discussed family patterns, the subtle ways expectations had been imposed, and how they could be navigated more mindfully in the future. Savannah lingered nearby, her presence quieter than before, her role diminished naturally without drama, an implicit acknowledgement of the consequences she had faced. I spoke gently but firmly, balancing honesty with compassion, aware that our shared history required nuance and care. Through these exchanges, the emotional undercurrents began to shift, reconciliation threading through the words unsaid as much as those spoken. The heirloom from the wedding, a small but potent symbol of observation and patience, rested on the counter, quietly tying past and present together. The consequences of prior actions, S16 through S18, played out with a quiet realism. Guests and extended family had witnessed subtle realignments, social acknowledgement of my contributions, Savannah's recognition of limits, and Velma's softened oversight. It wasn't dramatic, not a spectacle of revenge, but a measured, meaningful restoration of balance. I allowed myself a private smile, savoring the moral and strategic victory while noting that empowerment did not require grand gestures. It was the knowledge that effort, intelligence, and integrity had prevailed, that subtle observation and measured action had produced real-world justice, which brought the deepest satisfaction. The weight of years spent silently contributing without recognition had been lifted, and in that relief, clarity emerged. As the afternoon light shifted, I wandered into the garden, reflecting on the lessons embedded in this experience. Trust, boundaries, the quiet assertion of self, these were not abstract concepts but tangible practices, honed through experience. I reminded myself that intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking were as much tools of emotional survival as they were markers of personal growth. I considered quotes I had long carried in memory, wisdom about timing, perception, and self-respect. These reflections grounded me in both gratitude and resolve, reinforcing the understanding that one's place in a family, and in life, could be claimed without yielding integrity or calm. In the final moments of this quiet reflection, I watched the leaves shift in a gentle breeze, the garden alive with small sounds and movements that felt comforting and steady. The family had shifted too, subtly but undeniably, each member aware of new limits, new acknowledgments, new respect. Yet, even in this calm, I recognized that past patterns would linger, reminders of the complexity of human relationships. I felt the weight of all that had transpired, the lessons learned, the patience exercised, and the quiet triumph earned. And in that reflective peace, I knew I had claimed not only recognition but serenity. Even in the quietest moments, I knew I had claimed my place and my peace.